My dear friends, it's very good for me to be back in Mexico City, where I have been several times, as my hotel reminded me. They wrote me a nice card saying, welcome back for the 5th time, and I couldn't even remember when was the last time that I had been here. The topic today is one which is close to my heart and also close to my life. So I'd like to begin by just describing for a few minutes my own background. I'm from India. I have been for most of my life a banker. And this is a picture I took of my last office, which was an offshoring center that I had set up in Mumbai, in India, for my employers, Deutsche Bank. The way this works is that I used to go into the Indian Institutes of Technology and hire literally dozens, 20 people at a time. And then I would bring trainers and train them to do all the work that was being done by the investment bankers and the traders and the salespeople in London and New York. So I was not popular in London and New York. So this was very successful, however, and I think through this enterprise, which began with 50 people when I left, we had 350 doing this. And a few months back, I was very pleased. They called me back to speak as a kind of valedictory session because it was their 6th anniversary. And now there are 750 people there. So this has worked, definitely. But while I was doing all this and living my life as an investment banker, I also had a hobby. And that hobby was green accounting, because since my youth and my studies of first physics and then economics, I could not understand why we just neglected in economics this whole idea of externalities. The idea that there are some things which are very valuable but have no price, and we ignore them. And then there are other things which have a price and we just, so keen and so interested in them. So I thought that it's important for us as a developing country in India to understand that our GDP is not the real measure of our performance. It's not the way we are going to achieve success. And I began this project called the Green Accounting Project for Indian States. Like Mexico, India has many states, now 28 states, and it's a huge country, even bigger than yours. There's 1.2 billion people. And in India, if you make any statements, people ignore you because, what you say which applies to India is like, the world is bad, the world is going to end. It's like pointless. So you have to make a comment at the state level, at the local level. And that's what my friends and I had done. We did a whole calculation about the impacts of environmental losses, of freshwater losses, of forest losses, of biodiversity, and so on and so forth, what it meant for the state level, and also the positives. What does it mean when you educate young people, like the people I showed you in my office? When you create human capital, when you give them skills which they can use to earn more money, what does that mean for the human capital of the country? And when you pollute or poison waters, or when you ruin forests and wetlands, what does that mean for the natural capital of your country? We calculated all those things, and the beauty of this exercise was that everything we were calculating was not in GDP. Neither the increases in in human capital, which were huge, in fact 180 some states 100 to 200% of GDP. Neither the losses of natural capital, which were 30-40% of GDP in some cases. Nothing was there in the GDP. That's the problem. That we are looking at our future, our lives, with the wrong lens. We do not value what matters, and that's one basic problem in the way that we are running this planet. So the green GDP adjustments we calculated were quite significant, and many people in the government of India, including especially the Supreme Court, actually took notice, and I was very touched when the Supreme Court actually used our information as evidence to change and improve the rules for valuing protected areas, and in fact preventing. They multiplied the value that was there for cutting into protected area, they multiplied it by 5 to 10 times based on whether it's a reserve forest or whether it's a national park, and that was thanks to these numbers. So whilst the work was academic, it actually had some real use in protecting these areas and providing a deterrent, a prevention method for commercial use of those areas. I guess it was that work that led to this project called TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. And how many of you have heard of TEEB before? So I don't want to spend, everyone has heard of TEEB before, so I'll spend very little time describing the project, which began with sound foundations, because it was on the basis of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and the Stern Review and so much other good work that had been done. And the idea was to try and assess the damage impact on the natural environment and to present the results, but also to present solutions. What can be done? And we presented solutions at every level, at the business level, at the national level, at the local level, and within the public as well. And I'm pleased now that even it has been converted to books and it is being used by many countries, and I'll describe that as we go on. But I think one important thing about the TEEB project is that we wrote not for ourselves, not because we were interested in what we did, but because we wanted change to happen. So we wrote not only the science and the economics, which of course everyone is interested in, but we also wrote specifically what changes in policy areas can be made as a result of using better valuations of ecosystem services. What changes can be made in cities, in communities, in local areas, in states and provinces. That was another report. Then what changes can be made in the way we do business? And then finally an overall summary of that, and that was presented in COP10. And if we look back to why TEEB is necessary, basically it's because nature is at the heart of our economies. And if we look at human well-being, and today's conference is about well-being and ecosystems and how to value ecosystem services for protected areas. But if we look at well-being, look at all that ecosystems do provide us. It's sustainable livelihoods for the poor local communities, it's employment for people, the value that water provides, the security that it provides, food security that comes from nature's flows into agricultural areas, health, being able to access it, and of course, mitigation as well as adaptation against climate change. All of these are economic values. Unfortunately, hardly any of them, in fact, get reflected in the way that we do policy or the way that we do business. So the reason for that, of course, is basically because of the economic invisibility of what nature provides. The problem is price is what you pay, value is what you receive. And our whole world nowadays is so fixated on markets that when we have a situation where we receive value, like we receive value from nature, we don't understand that until there's a price. And the problem is there will be no price because these values are public goods and services. They will not have a price because basically, even though the valuation of the pollination that comes from insects, especially bees, is more than $200 billion, right? $200 billion is a large amount of value which comes thanks to their pollination. But when did a bee ever send you an invoice? Right? The value of trees providing nutrients and fresh water to the fields of poor farmers or providing air cleaning services is huge. But when did a tree ever send you an invoice, right? So unless these invoices happen and unless they're captured in national accounts, which may never happen, that challenge is always there. Humanity has to understand value without depending on prices. Value is what you receive. Just because nature gives it to you free, that doesn't mean it doesn't have value. It just means it doesn't have a price. So praise, value, different things. And people, because of our psychology, we just keep forgetting this. And I think that's very important to explain to people that there is a difference between value and price. Now, the economic invisibility of nature is a problem because today's politicians do not understand anything unless you explain it in economic terms. Economics has become the language of policy making, and that's just the way it is. There's nothing that you or I can do to fix that. And in fact, one of the first people to understand that more than 250 years ago, or 230 years ago, is basically Benjamin Franklin, when he said that he believed that the great part of the miseries of mankind are brought upon them by false estimates they have made of the value of things. Basically a valuation problem. So that's one reason. Second reason is because to do something, to solve this huge problem of not being able to recognize and reflect values because there are no prices in public goods, to actually address that problems, you don't just need ecologists, you also need economists, you need social anthropologists, you need people who are experts at mapping, technologists. You need so many different people, and therefore, and of course you need this around the world because biodiversity is not something simple. It's not like a gas. Like climate change, you can work out in carbon dioxide equivalents. Biodiversity is about local forms of life and local ecosystems everywhere around the world. So you need a huge and collaborative effort, and that's why when we created TEEB, it was very much an open architecture, and so many people were involved in it. Thirdly, the decision-making groups, people who decide what happens, are totally different. On the one hand, you have businesses. On the other, you have local communities, mayors, province heads. And on the other, you have national governments. And then you have international agreements, such as for climate change mitigation and adaptation. And finally, because there is a need to pull all this together and pick out the best examples and broadcast them, because finally, TEEB is about solving this big problem of the economic invisibility of nature and its services. I think the fifth problem is something which I will spend a bit of time today, because people failed to understand for a long time, and maybe some still don't, that there is a huge connection between equity, equitable access, and poverty, on the other hand. And Professor Juan Martinez Alier, he's from Barcelona. He is also a great guide of mine, and he was helping me with the Indian project way back, and then finally he joined the board of TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystems. This is what he said, basically in his book called The Environmentalism of the Poor, where he basically talked about their environmentalism as having to do with livelihoods, as being able to access the goods and services that nature provides. It was about access, and it was about accessing things which came directly from nature, not from markets. There were no markets, no prices. And he said this is a particular challenge. He's right, it is, and that's very, very important. And in fact, if you were to ask me, like, what is the most important thing that TEEB came out with, to me, this is it. It's the valuation in terms of the poor, what nature means to the poor. And here's a quick summary of how we went about showing that. We took 3 countries, Indonesia, India, and Brazil. And of course, we had, because there's a lot of work being done on these areas, we had estimates already of the value of ecosystem services in these countries, forest ecosystem services. And these values, if we compared them to the GDP of these countries, were 10%, 16%, 21%. But that doesn't sound very impressive, so what? If it is invisible and it's only 10, 20%, that's okay, it's a problem, but it's not the end of the world. But actually, that's the wrong question and that's the wrong thinking. Because what you have to ask is, who are the people who really depend on ecosystem services? And if you ask, well, who would suffer if those ecosystem services disappeared? Well, if the forests die away, then number one who suffers is the farmer, because nutrients and fresh water will stop flowing from the forests to the aquifers to his fields. The second person to suffer probably is his wife, because she depends on fuel wood for cooking. And then, of course, she and he would both depend on accessing the forest for non-timber forest products and anything else they get from it. Their goats and their cows would be going into the forest to feed off the leaf litter. So if there are no forests or they're too far away, once again, it's the poor farmer and the village family that suffers. So if we put it this way, actually, not the question, what is ecosystem services as a fraction of GDP, but instead, what are ecosystem services consumed by poor households as a fraction of the GDP of the poor households? That's a completely different answer. And that answer, friends, is more like 75% in Indonesia for the 100 million farmers, the small farmers, or it is like 47% in India for the 250 million small farmers and 80 million forest-dependent tribals, and it is more like almost 90%, 89% for the 20-odd million people in northern Brazil who depend on the forest for their livelihood. That's the whole point, that ecosystem services as a fraction of the GDP of the poor are not small, they are very big. And even though to you and me it may not make a difference because we live in cities and we buy things from shops and supermarkets, to them, to those hundreds of millions of people who are in poverty, that makes a huge difference. Not understanding this and then trying to design strategies for so-called development, which is at the same time destroying natural capital, is actually a mistake. Because if you're destroying natural capital, you are actually destroying the GDP of the poor. And how then are you going to help the poor?
So in summary, there are basically 5 big reasons to do what the TEEB project has embarked on, which is to try and solve for the economic invisibility of nature. One is that when we did the calculation way back in 2008, we had commissioned a study called the cost of policy in action. When we did that calculation to see what eventually are people suffering the losses in terms of economic size, how big are these losses? We found out that they're quite huge. They're 2 to 5 trillion, so $2 to $5 million. And that means something like between 3% and 6% of global GDP. So that's quite significant, that's big. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2, I just explained to you that this is not just a big number, but in fact, by doing business as usual, that's what BAU is, doing business as usual, you are basically destroying the GDP of the poor. The third reason for doing TEEB is that there are solutions. There are many, many examples of good solutions. And I'm delighted that Patty is here in the audience. Patty Ruiz, please raise your hand. She's been working on solutions for all the 5-7 years that I have known her. And there are so many good solutions which can be replicated and scaled, which means reproduced somewhere else and made bigger. There are lots of solutions, and that ability to find economic solutions, replicate them and scale them, exists with us, but we don't use it. Basically because the information isn't there, people aren't pushing it out, and nobody's really trying to do that. And that's another reason why TEEB exists. Fourthly, to realize the productive and employment potential of natural capital. If we look at nature in terms of the infrastructure it provides, whether it is freshwater cycling or nutrient cycling, or whether it is climate protection, it is some kind of an infrastructure, but it's a natural infrastructure. Today, if you build a bridge or build a road, government pays you. But today, if you replant a forest or recreate a wetland, who do you think will pay you? But they need to stop thinking like that, because the returns on investment in natural ecosystems are actually higher, and we have done these calculations, are actually higher than most of the other returns in ecosystem, in physical goods. And we worked out returns on investments of the order of between 25% and even 75%. Those kinds of returns on any infrastructure project, if it's building a bridge or a railroad or a road, would be considered excellent projects. And yet, if nature provides us those flows back because we are replanting forests or wetlands or mangroves or whatever, we don't think about that. And that, again, is a question of psychology. Public goods and services always get neglected when it comes to deciding how to spend government money. So we have to point out that there is opportunity for employment here. There is opportunity for return here. It is an economic solution at the massive macro scale, which we are ignoring to our own costs. And finally, and the last point is that what kind of an economic system do we have if something which is in poor countries, the single largest capital asset is completely invisible? It's not on your balance sheet. You are trying to run a company, if you are trying to run a company and you had a factory that was your biggest asset and you did not put the factory in your balance sheet, what would happen? One day somebody would say, oh, well, I want to remove that door because I need some wood for my fire because I run out. They would say, okay, because there's no cost, right? You're not accounting for it. And some other day they would say, oh, this machinery is really nice and I've found a great buyer. Take the machinery and sell it. Then tomorrow your production system is not there anymore because you just sold the machinery. But of course, when you sell the machinery, if it's not on your balance sheet, it doesn't show, right? All that shows is cash. Cash came in, profit. No, you've destroyed, you've lost an asset. You've lost an asset and you've not recorded it. It's as foolish as that. The way that we do GDP accounting in nations nowadays is as foolish as not accounting for your biggest asset in a factory, selling it and accounting for the cash that comes in, but nothing else. And yet we do it. Every nation in the world does this, and that's why the WAVES project, which I will talk about later on, has been introduced. This is basically bad economics, right? Economics is about scarce resources. Economics is about valuation. If you are not valuing assets, if you are not respecting scarcity, then you are not doing good economics, period. And nobody can argue about that. So we need to fix this. And basically it's about fixing economics as well. Now, what is TEEB? Very often when I talk about TEEB, especially I must say in Latin America, people say, you're selling Mother Nature. I say, I'm not selling Mother Nature. This is a joke, of course, that you have this consultant lady who comes along and shows a map of the world and saying, oh, well, those species are unprofitable, so they'll be laid off, we'll lose their jobs. No, that's not what it's about. And then you have a little dung beetle sitting out there saying, but I'm very important because I provide nutrients and so on. Teeb's approach is very, very thoughtful and very, very careful. Firstly, we understand that valuation is a human institution, right? And valuation has been happening all the time. Just because if you make a choice where you are paying something for maintaining a certain object or an ecosystem service, by definition you are valuing it. If you don't pay that price, or if you don't protect that ecosystem, what you are saying implicitly is that it's not worth much to me. It's not worth as much as something else. So valuation happens either implicitly or explicitly. Nobody can stop it. It's just a question of, is it happening in your head, in your responses, or is it happening in terms of exchanges? So that valuation is always happening. And even without economics, valuation happens. Because if you go back to tribal communities in my country, in one state called Himachal in the north, there are more than 5,000 communities who have sacred groves because they believe their deity spirits live there, deities and their ancestral spirits live there. So they would not ever touch those groves, they would not ever cut a tree there because they're sacred. So they value it with their lives. They don't need economics for that, they just value them. Equally, when protected areas were created in the old days, I mean, if you look at the early protected areas way back in the UK, the Lancashire Downs or the Yorkshire Downs or the Lake District or whatever, there wasn't any question of economics there. The people decided this is a place that needs to be kept for posterity. So they were valuing the uniqueness and the beauty of those areas and keeping them for posterity, for future generations. That valuation, or for that matter, Yosemite National Park or any of the big old national parks around the world, were valued basically because of the respect for the area as a unique spot for future destinations. So you can create values by just recognizing value. And aspects such as, these are little symbols that we use in Teeb for the Millennium Ecosystem Services. The one on the top left showing someone meditating is inspiration, design inspiration. And then the owl flying is basically habitat for species. These things are just values that you can recognize, and for that matter, genetic material, genetic diversity. You don't need to sort of express them in economic terms. But in other cases, it's useful to express values in economic terms. For instance, if you have the value that forests provide for preventing soil erosion, that's economically very useful. I'll come back to that point. Or if you provide, as I mentioned, pollinators, bee-based pollination, that's economically useful and it can be valued. And we know the costs of that. Or for that matter, cleaning fresh water, the function of swamps and mangroves, that can be valued, that is economically significant. And then finally, in some cases, you can capture the value, which means somebody pays, somebody else receives. Payments for ecosystem services are examples of that. Of course, this is the carbon system, this is the value of medicines being discovered, this is the value of sort of cleaning services that even vultures and others provide in keeping ecosystem areas healthy and clean. And of course, these are materials like timber and fiber that we get from the forests. These are all, and food, of course, and fish. These are values which can be transacted in markets. Somebody can pay for them, someone can receive them. All of these are values. Now, in summary, therefore, valuations and operating spaces and our responses. Here's how Teeb looks at it. Basically, we believe in valuation as consisting of one of three concentric circles. You can recognize value. After recognizing value, sometimes you can demonstrate it. And if you demonstrate the value, sometimes you can capture it. And in each of these situations, there are different typical strategies that the Teeb approach, that the Teeb work recommends. So here are the 5 most popular types of strategies. Regional planning. Basically, example, for instance, there was an area in Sichuan province in China where they had gone through and used the Invest software to look at where ecosystem services are coming from because of the value that they had to nutrients and fresh water. And they actually changed their regional plan based on understanding those ecosystem services. Now, they didn't do a formal economic valuation, but they did the measurement. So that's one example of a strategy where you can amend your regional plans based on understanding ecosystem services. There's, of course, any amount of legislation where you legislate a national park. For instance, in Philippines, after the coral bleaching in 1998, the Tubahata coral reef was installed as a no-go area, basically preventing fisheries there. And that decision was made jointly by the local fishermen, by the local government, by the national government, and by a whole number of NGOs. So collectively they decided not to go fishing there. And as a result of that decision, fish stocks were restored. And in fact, a few years later, in 2004, they actually expanded the no-go zone, and they kept it for some time because of the value of increased fish supply. Certification can be used. An example is the white stork, which was in Japan. It was basically a species that had disappeared. They reintroduced old-fashioned farming, which is organic farming, because the white stork feeds in water which is deep. And new forms of rice farming have less water, so therefore you don't get the food of the white stork. They reintroduced the white stork and it survived. And in that city, they've actually got a museum, so they've created a whole experiment out of that. They certify that rice, which has organic rice, as white stork rice. So it's a certification that it has used organic methods and is produced using an eco-friendly fashion and so on, and that attracts value. So certification can generate value. Protected areas can be valued, and one great example of valuing a protected area is from Uganda, the Nakivubo swamp, which was outside the city of Kampala, the capital. It's basically a swamp, and the original plan was to dam it so that it could be turned into more agriculture and residential space. But an economist came and did a valuation of that swamp, the services of the swamp as a sewage treatment plant, a natural sewage treatment plant, were more than 8 or 10 times the value of the swamp after conversion costs into more agriculture. So the city actually decided to keep the swamp because it was absorbing the human sewage from Kampala city. The fish, the bacteria would break it down, the fish would eat, and so on and so forth. So basically it was providing a very valuable function, and it would have cost the city several times more to recreate that sewage treatment as a physical plant, as a construction plant. So these are different ways in which ecosystem services valuations can actually help conserve ecosystems. And finally, of course, there's payments for ecosystem services, where any amount of freshwater payments or biodiversity payments can be done. And that is called capturing value. Another way of looking at it is not in terms of the kinds of valuation, but in the kinds of responses. And if you look at it like that, then regional planning and legislation is basically a norm, basically regulations and policies. There are also norms. The people who in communities have a norm that respects nature and that ensures conservation. Certification, protected area valuation, and payments for ecosystem services are basically economic mechanisms. And then finally, you also have markets. There are also some markets where you can pay, buy and sell. But that's very few. And to give you an idea, I've got this summary of all of the case studies in TEEB. TEEB, of course, is a huge set of reports. But we've summarized and put together all of the examples in TEEB of policy analysis and how valuation and how that led to a change on the ground. And if you look at this, there are 6 examples of laws enacting protected areas. There are 7 examples of taxes and subsidies, eco-labeling and certification, 38 protected area valuations given in TEEB, valuations for various services, leading to a change in the way the PA is handled, or leading to more money for the protected area, or leading to the creation of the protected area. Lots of payments for ecosystem services, example, land use planning, etc. There are only 11 markets examples. So out of the 119 cases of economics of ecosystems, we have only got 11. So of course markets are useful when, in some circumstances, but not every solution that is an economic solution or a policy solution is a market solution. Markets are a very small part of the overall picture. Now when we talk about markets, you can't ignore business. Business is a very important end user of ecosystem services, and business also is a very important agent of change. It can negatively affect ecosystems. So here's an example from China. If we look at what happened over the period, the 1950s to the end of 1998, significant amount of logging was taking place in the forests of China. 2/3 of the logging was basically for construction sector. And in 1997, because of the severe losses of forests in China, in 1997, the Yellow River went dry. It's a huge river, and when it went dry, several hundred villages suffered entire losses of their crops, and of course severe poverty and famine. And at the same, just a year later, the Yangtze River flooded because of uncontrolled, the lack of absorption of water. So literally within 2 years, you had a massive drought and a massive flood. And I think that was a signal enough for the Chinese government to change its laws. So it actually imposed conservation laws in 17, 18 states within China, recognizing that what was happening was basically as a result of deforestation. Now, what was happening in the economics? Basically, 60% of the cost of all these losses of services was basically because of logging, and most of the logging was for construction materials, and most of that construction material was actually going overseas. It was going to USA, Japan, Europe, Korea, and even Hong Kong. So who was winning and who was losing? Basically, the people of China were losing because their lives were being affected, their crops were being affected. They were selling too cheap. If you look at this calculation that we did in Thebe, this was the price, average price of timber in China, and if we account for all the costs of logging, including the lost precipitation, desertification, reduced timber, loss of river transport, etc., and the flooding damage in 1998, if you account for all that, that's 1.5 times, 1.4 times the actual price of timber. So effectively what was happening was timber was being sold too cheap for construction material for all these countries, and the cost of that was actually to the people of China. Of course that changed, but didn't completely solve the problem because the logging went elsewhere. The logging did not stop. So this example is basically an example of what we call externalities, which means the third-party costs of doing business. There was not, until 1998, it wasn't illegal to do any logging out there. So it was just business, and business was doing it because that's what business does. It makes profits. It doesn't really account for third-party costs. The third-party costs for all of these costs, and of course, most importantly, the loss of agriculture for the people during the drought and the loss of lives during the flood. So none of that was accounted for. These are all externalities. Nowadays, a trend has just begun, where some companies have started calculating their externalities, and that is really admirable because it shows their responsibility. Unfortunately, very few companies, really Puma and Infosys, only 2 so far, although I'm aware of at least 10 others who have done this but have not disclosed it for various reasons. But the important thing is it's possible to do this. Today, it's possible for a company not just to report its profits for shareholders, but to report its gains and losses for stakeholders as well. And this is really important because today's corporation has to understand that it consists of 60–70% of the economy and jobs. It is the single most important institution of our times. We cannot have a green economy, we cannot have TEEP being implemented unless corporations are involved and they participate and they are responsible. Now the good thing is we have a few nice leadership examples like Puma, but the bad thing is that we don't have enough. And to achieve more, we will need to get rules to change. We will need to get the accountancy regulators around the world, all of the institutes of chartered accountants, to ask for these kinds of calculations to be done on the basis of standards and guidelines that they have set. And these are huge. If you look at what we learned from the Puma example, it's a company that makes profits of $250 million. Its total externalities, all of these costs of water usage and greenhouse gases and land use change and air pollution and waste and so on, all of them is about 145 million euros. That's about $200 million. So $250 million profit, $200 public losses. Private profits, public losses. That's not a good way forward. That's not creating value for society. But the good thing is this company understood this. The chairman of the company understood that, and he wanted to be transparent, so he set an example. And of course now they are negotiating with their suppliers and trying to see where most of their costs are actually along the supply chain. So they are trying to see what they can do to change the supply chain, reduce the use of the damaging aspects of their supply chain, and renegotiate with suppliers. The thing is, 1 or 2 examples is not enough, so we have to figure out how do we take this forward. And a coalition has been formed of many institutions
including the old Teep community, many of the research houses and bodies like the World Resources Institute, the Global Reporting Initiative, IUCN, and so on and so forth, all joined hands, and also the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales, who is in fact one of the founding members. They've all joined hands to work on this together, because that's the only way this will happen. We'll have to get a lot of people to collaborate in doing this. And some of the results are quite amazing. If you look at the top 100 externalities, the biggest sectors which cause damages, coal-fired power generation is huge, 450 billion in China and East Asia, 300 billion in the US. And the second largest one is actually beef and cattle in Latin America. So that cattle ranching produces huge costs, because the cost is to lost forests due to, of course, expansion of ranching areas, but also due to the agriculture for soya, which feeds the cattle. So there's a double problem there. And the worrying thing here is that we think we are doing good things because, every sector makes some money, it has some value, but actually the value here is a lot less than the externalities. The value is only about $17 billion. The externalities, the third-party costs, are $350 billion. So this whole sector is generating almost 18 times as many costs as it is generating value for people in terms of the food, the beef that it produces. I want to say a few words about how do we take this kind of valuation forward at a country level, and of course this includes valuing protected areas, because they are very important parts of that. I think the important thing to remember is that success will not come. When you think success, it's in terms of conservation, but success will not come by working only from the point of view of conservation and only looking at just biodiversity and the species. It has to come by engaging the decision makers. And the most important decision makers are your governments, the policy makers, the different departments. So that is why when you start a team in a country, the first thing you do is to do a policy analysis. Step one, you sit down literally with all of the ministries. It's not just environment, it could be agriculture, fisheries ministry, forestry, energy, whoever is interested and involved. Sit down with them and work out what are their policy priorities. And when we have done that, and we share this in a very open way, we work with universities and with NGOs and with local communities and with government officers, we just share it in a very open stakeholder dialogue. And once we've done that, then we come to an idea as to what is important. So if, for example, the development ministry says that actually livelihoods for the poor are the most important, then you sit down with them and say, okay, here are 10 examples we have brought of livelihoods being supported by forests and wetlands. So clearly, if we make sure we maintain the forests and the wetlands, you will help livelihoods? Yes. Okay, then let's list this down. And if somebody else says, well, my problem is desertification. As a policy priority, we must stop desertification. That happens. In both India and China have serious desertification. They have big budgets for prevention of desertification. But the solution for preventing it is to plant forests back so that it prevents that. So actually, it is about biodiversity and ecosystems, but it's coming from desertification. Somewhere else, the initiative could come from freshwater management. Somewhere else, it could come from poverty eradication, and so on and so forth. You have to go and talk to the ministries about what is their problem, not what is your problem. That's when you will get solutions to your problem, which is loss of biodiversity. So when we've identified which ecosystem services are important for the policy priorities, then we see, okay, do we already have valuations done? And if not, then we have identified the gaps. Once we have identified the gaps, then we set about finding ecosystem service values. And then when we finish that exercise, then we sit down and evaluate based on that information. What are the policy solutions? What kind of policy solutions? In other words, should it be land use planning? Should it be investment in protected areas? Should it be restoration? Should it be, mitigation, REDD+? What should it be? What should we do? Should it be just planting forests to prevent the ingress of deserts, etc., etc., etc.? And then when we've done that again, then think of the distributional impacts. This solution that I'm suggesting, is it going to help the poor, or is it going to make their lives more difficult? Think about that. Think about the distributional impacts of the solutions. All of this is TEEB. So it's not just go and find an interesting species or a nice location and do a valuation. That's not TEEB. This is TEEB. And this is the way it is being done. There are more than
26 countries who have started it. Very often I'm asked, but what is TEEB and what is WAVES? Well, here's what it is. The first thing to bear in mind, WAVES stands for Wealth Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services. Wealth accounting means national wealth accounting. In order to account for national wealth, you need to value ecosystem services. In fact, both TEEB and WAVES need to value ecosystem services, the same ecosystems and the same services. So it makes absolute sense to do these projects together. Do the TEEB projects and the WAVE projects together. That's what is being done in the best examples. And the reason for that is that when you use TEEB for valuation, you are addressing things like managing protected areas, land use planning, designing payments for ecosystem services, designing value-based recommendations for all of the other national policy priorities, whether they relate to poverty or livelihoods or agriculture or water or desertification, etc. When you use WAVES, you are adjusting, and that's very important, you are adjusting the national accounts. So you are giving a signal to the policymakers of what actually matters. For the first time, they're looking at real numbers. So they will not imagine that GDP growth is happening if they've destroyed natural capital to create it. So they will get the right signals in order to respond with policies. And WAVES is actually one of the recommendations of the TEEB report. It was one of our top recommendations is we must include natural capital in national accounts, and we spelt out how it can be done. So we were actually very happy when the World Bank responded, and President Bob Zoellick, when we launched the TEEB in Nagoya, said, yes, we're going to do this. And a few months later, they started the project. They called it WAVES. So these have to be done together. And the interesting thing also is that there are different purposes for valuation. The purpose could be just adjust the national accounts, and you make assumptions when you're valuing it. You will use the end of the assumption range that makes the smallest difference to your national accounts, because the idea is not to create a big commotion and noise. The idea is to just remind policymakers that there's value here that needs to be accounted for. The same ecosystem with the same service to the same people, if you're valuing it for instance, one province paying money to another province because one has the forest and the water and the other one is receiving it, and there is an opportunity cost in the province which has the forests and the water, and there's a productivity gain in the other state, you will value it at a fair rate because these are two provinces within the nation. Again, the same ecosystem services from the same place, if you were to value it for promoting the benefits to local communities and encouraging local communities to do the right things, you would value it even higher. So the same service in the different context could be valued in 3 different ways. That's fine. That's not a problem. But the important thing is to know what context it is. So the purpose of the valuation will determine the valuation. That's really, really important for everyone to recognize. And that's what I mean, that you have to run these, you will have to find out the same numbers for ecosystem services, but what you use in valuations will be different depending on what it's for. Now, TEEB has been launched in many countries, and the latest one is this tiny place called Georgia out here. And I was this is their scoping study, which was presented by them. This was very recent, actually, the 1st of October. I was quite impressed with them because they did this the right way, which is they had gone through and done the complete assessment of what were their policy priorities. So they had gone and recognized that they have a huge hydropower export to Russia. And one of the big problems in the old dams is that, yes, there is siltation, and the life of the dam declines because of siltation and the lack of forestry and the lack of forest cover in that area. They had also recognized the importance of ecotourism, of forests, and of the flows of nutrients and fresh water into agriculture. So when the TEEB country study was launched in Tbilisi on the 1st of this month, just 3 weeks ago, we had 5 ministers in the room. There was a deputy prime minister who is apparently going to be the next prime minister, finance minister, energy minister, agriculture minister, and of course my host, the environment minister. 5 ministers together doing the ministerial launch of the TEEB study. And then that was followed by a big public launch with press and this, that, and the other. So that was a good thing, is that they had focused on policy priorities, and their scoping study is basically about the policy priorities and which ecosystem services already have been identified as important, and therefore what work is required to create valuations for them. And I think that really is the way forward in terms of doing country TEEB. Valuation is a human institution, as I've said. It's something that we do implicitly or explicitly. You know, you can have valuations without economics, right? You can value as a human being, as a society, and so on. But you cannot have economics without valuation. So actually, valuation is in some ways a bigger subject, a wider subject than economics. And please don't ever forget to remind the economists about that. Markets are just one of many solutions, and economic mechanisms are amongst the big groups of solutions, and in fact there are solutions which are policy solutions and administrative solutions which are even beyond that. All of that is basically the landscape of TEEB. When you go ahead and value protected areas, think about the policy priorities, and in fact I would suggest first go and check out your policy priorities and then see what kind of answers you're getting. You might find that the answers you're getting are powerful and useful, and you might find through this communication that in fact you present a better case for your protected areas and for the valuation of those to be respected and reflected in policy and budgeted, and so that you actually get better conservation. So I believe that valuation is definitely something we must engage in, and that doing it the way that we are recommending in TEEB will give you greater success for your purpose, which is finally to protect conservation and improve your protected areas. Thank you.